Hey traders, it's John Fortune here with this week's weekly Forex forecast for the 15th of May to the 19th of May 2017. I'm going to start with the US dollar index and oil, and then I'm going to run through a number of currency pairs, and we're going to look at some key levels of support and resistance in the process. Key levels of support and resistance will be trend lines, psychological levels, and also horizontal support and resistance levels. I have made the charts cleaner this week because I feel like the simpler they are, the easier it will be for you to understand and to see the thought processes behind the analysis. So I have removed some of the things this week, so it should be a lot clearer for you. So I hope you all had a great week last week. Let's jump over to the charts and we can see where the money is this week. US dollar index. US dollar index has found some support, somewhat support. This downward sloping trend line here. I do now expect the US dollar index to bounce and potentially come down next week and test the 12,250 level over here. And this upward sloping trend line, as you can see, these two trend lines here denote this is in like a wedge formation. So I do expect to test the bottom of the wedge next week. If we get a breakout of this, the top of the wedge here, I'm going to be looking for the 12,383 on US dollar index. So we're going to have some dollar weakness, a bias of dollar weakness next week, unless we get a breakout above this upward sloping trend line. Oil pulled back to this major upward sloping trend line, which it broke out of. I don't see this as anything significant. It did close above here, but I think this is still, I still see this as just a correction. If we do get a break a little bit further up, I am going to look for a retest of the 48.83 level here. However, my bias on oil overall is still negative, and I do think we could be seeing declines down to the 43, around about the $43 a barrel area, with the next key support level being around the 43.39 area. So we may see a little bit of CAD strength next week if it does push a little bit higher first, but overall I'm going to be looking for some declines in oil. Euro US dollar. Euro US dollar is in this major wedge. You can see this downward sloping trend line here and this upward sloping trend line here. We did get a bounce off of the top of this wedge, and it came back to this resistance area here at the 1.086. It has bounced from here, so if we are going to see weakness in the US dollar and this does break out of here, I'm going to be looking for the 1.1100 level as the next key area of resistance up here. However, if it stays in this wedge and it actually starts to break down lower, below the 1.0866 level, then we could be looking at closing this gap on the first round of the French elections as it comes down to the 1.0700 area and also this downward sloping trend line here. So I do have a dollar weakness bias next week, so that would suggest that this is going to push up higher, maybe even a retest at the top of the wedge. I would like to see this out of this wedge before we look at trading this to the upside, but if we do get some dollar strength, then we'll be looking at closing the gap down roughly to the 1.0700 level. US dollar Japanese yen. US dollar Japanese yen did break out of this major down sloping trend line here, and it has just started to pull back. So I'm looking for a pullback potentially to the 11200 level and this and a retest of this broken trend line. But generally speaking, we are looking to initiate longs on this pair, and I am looking to take some long positions up to the 115.80 area of resistance up here, possibly next week. The one thing we have to watch out for, as we said, if we do get some dollar weakness next week, then we may be seeing this pulling back first to the 11200 area. But overall, I would be looking to take longs on this pair, as long as the US dollar is not too weak. And we don't get into a kind of choppy corrective, long-term corrective move here or a drawn-out corrective period. But as you can see, technically it is trending up. It has broken out, so we'll be looking at taking longs to the 11580 area. Pound US dollar. Pound US dollar quite simply is forming this kind of rising wedge pattern. We have been looking for it to trade into the 1,300 area for a little while now, but it has been struggling, and as you can see, because it's been struggling, it has been creating this rising wedge as it's been getting squeezed. So you can see it's at the bottom of the wedge now. It is in an uptrend, so I do expect this to potentially come and test the 1.300 level next week and the top of this wedge up here. Top of the rising wedge up here. So I would be looking for longs on the pound US dollar next week, especially if we get the US dollar weakness from this area. However, if we start to break out of here and we start to break down out of this rising wedge, then I will be looking for potential pullback to the 1.2700 area of support down here. US dollar franc. US dollar franc, we were looking for this kind of head and shoulders formation like this. We did get a breakout of this downward sloping trend line. In fact, this is the trend line of the head and shoulders, as you can see. Right shoulder, head, left shoulder, head, right shoulder. So we did get a breakout above here. However, as you can see, last week it did actually end the week by selling off and closing back inside this wedge. So if we do see some US dollar weakness next week, then I am going to be looking for the US dollar franc to come down to the 0.9950 area down here. So if we see US dollar weakness, I'm going to be looking for a short down into this kind of area. If we see it start to break up though, however, and we don't get the dollar weakness that we're looking for, then I will be looking at trading this into the 1.0157 area up here. So if it starts to hold back above this downward sloping trend line, we can look for longs to the 1.0157 area of resistance up here. Aussie US dollar. Aussie US dollar came down to the 0.7350 area of support down here, which we were actually looking for in a previous weekly forecast around this kind of area here. As you can see, it came down and bounced from this area. However, it is in a downtrend. I mean, we're seeing lower lows, lower highs, lower lows, lower highs. So I do expect this to come down and test the 0.7300 area. If we do see dollar weakness and we see oil start to go up, then we could be looking at a pullback first to the 0.745 area. But whether from here or from up at the 0.745 area, I do think shorts on this down to the 0.7300 area are preferable. We'll just have to see how it plays out next week and where the opportunities to get involved with this to the downside will be. But just to confirm, the 0.7300 area is the next key area of support I'm looking at on this pair. US dollar CAD. US dollar CAD pretty much did nothing for the whole of last week. As you can see, it's in this kind of corrective pattern at the moment. We had this engulfing candle last week, and then we spent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days inside this engulfing candle we had before the actual start of last week. So we were looking for a pullback into the 1.36 area. Obviously, it didn't come last week because we just had a sideways move all week, which made trading this pair very difficult. However, I do think now if we see some dollar weakness, especially if the CAD starts, if oil starts to push a little bit higher, then we could be seeing this move down to the 1.3600 area down here. So I am still going to be looking for the same sort of plan we had last week, which is a trade down into the 1.36 area, potentially for a short, and then be looking to take longs from the 1.36 area up to the 1.3836 area, which I see as the next key area of resistance on this pair. New Zealand US dollar. New Zealand US dollar is being kept down by this downward sloping trend line, so I would favour shorts on this pair. It's tested this area of support here once, twice, and it did actually break through last week, and it closed underneath here. So I am expecting further declines in New Zealand US dollar. We do have the 0.6800 psychological level down here, which will be the next intermediary target. But overall, I would expect this to come down to the 0.6761 area of support down here. So we do have a dollar, a bias for some weakness on the dollar next week on the US dollar index. However, this is still setting up to the downside, and you may just find New Zealand is weaker than the US dollar. So still be keeping an eye on this, and I am going to look for shorts down to the 0.676 area on this pair. Euro pound. Euro pound, as you can see, I've cleaned up a little bit for you here. We're seeing a large descending triangle, and it did bounce to the bottom of the descending triangle down here. And we got a bounce off of here, and we did get a close of this gap that was caused on the Euro elections that we were looking for last week. In fact, we traded this. And now I am thinking that this is probably likely to come back up and test the top of this descending triangle and the 0.8600 area. So next week I will be looking for some moves to the upside on this pair. In fact, I think this could be quite a nice pair for next week to keep your eye on. And I do expect to see some higher moves, and I'm going to be looking at taking longs into the 0.8600 area up there. We may get a retest of the bottom of the descending triangle, but I'm going to favour longs on this pair next week. Euro-Japanese yen. Euro-Japanese yen is clearly in an uptrend here, and it has broken out of this downward sloping trend line. I do wonder if we're going to get a pullback to the 122 area of the 122 psychological area, and also this downward sloping trend line. We have a bit of a support confluence here. However, taking shorts here may be a little bit risky. I don't see anything here on the lower time frames right now which suggests that this is going to be coming down straight away. So my preference is to take some longs on this pair into the 12500 psychological level, and then above that is the 12600 psychological level. These are the two targets I'll be looking for on this pair, as we are starting to get a continuation pattern forming on the euro yen. If, however, like I say, it does start to break down and we see some weakness in the euro against the yen next week, then I'll be looking for a pullback and a retest this downward sloping trend line, the 12200 psychological level. Pound yen. Pound yen has made its way up to the 148 area of resistance up here that we were looking for. It has actually started to sell off. I still think it's going to trade into the 148.32 area of resistance up here. So I will be looking at taking a long position next week if we get a nice setup in the lower time frames. And I'll be looking at taking this into the 148.32 area up here. Once we get a breakthrough of this area, then I'm going to be looking for the 151.60 area of resistance as the next target to the upside. Just note that we may get a pullback first, though, to the 14500 psychological level here. So if we do get a pullback into this area, I would probably not look at taking shorts into this area. But if we get a pullback into this area, then I'll be looking at taking a long position from here if we get the right setup. And I'll be looking at taking this up to the 148.32 area up here. Franc yen. Franc yen broke out of this downward sloping trend line here, and as you can see, it's pulled back and it is just sitting quite nicely on top of this now, and also at the 113 psychological level here. If we get a breakdown back inside this downward sloping trend line here, I am going to be looking for the 112 area, the 112 psychological area down here. However, this is not the trade I'm looking for at the moment, because as you can see, it's broken out and it's pulled back. Resistance becoming support here, even though this is in the form of a trend line. And now I am going to be looking for a move up to this outer trend line here around the 114.85 area. And then if we get a breakout, if we get a breakout of this area, I'm going to be looking for the 11533, which is pretty much the top over here on this pretty large kind of bull flag we have here. So I am keeping my eye on Franc yen next week. I like the way this is setting up. I like the break and the pullback. So this is one of the ones that I'm going to be looking to trade next week up into the 114.80 area. So keep an eye on Franc yen. Pound franc. Pound franc, we got a breakout here of the major downward sloping trend line, and then we did get a break above the 1.289 area of resistance over here. Resistance becoming support, as you can see, it broke through and it's pulled back. So I am now looking to initiate longs in this pair next week up to the 1.31 psychological area, and then a little bit further to the 1.313, where I see the next key area of resistance on this pair. So pound franc, as you can see, it's trending quite nicely. It's pulled back into previous broken resistance. Hopefully this will become support, and pound franc, I am going to be looking at taking longs on this pair up to the 1.313 area next week, if we get the right kind of setups. Euro Australia. Euro Australia, it broke through, there was a resistance area here as well, but I've taken it off because we don't really need it at the moment. It's broken through and is sitting underneath this resistance area at the 1.485. So I did say last week that I do expect it to do a similar thing here as it did over here, which was namely come up to the resistance level, accumulate underneath it, and then break through. So as you can see, it has started to accumulate underneath this resistance level. I do expect this to break through because it's in a trend. And if this breaks through, if and when this breaks through and into this area, I am going to be looking for the 1.500 psychological area next week. If we get some start to see nice moves to the upside, so we can get on board this. So the 1.500 psychological area is where I'm going to be looking for next week. If we get some more selling coming into this, I'm probably just going to avoid it altogether because of the fact it is in a trend, and I don't really want to trade against this. EurCad. EurCad was sitting at this kind of resistance area, and it started to break down last week back below this resistance area. It is now pushing higher, and it is overall in an uptrend, as you can see. But I do wonder if this is now coming back to test this resistance, and if this is going to bounce from here and create a pullback to the major downward sloping trend line that it broke out of. So if we do get some shorts coming in at this area, I am going to be looking for a retest of this major broken trend line at roughly at the 1.47500 area across here. But if we start to see breaks above this 1.501 area up here, then I do see 1.526 as the next key area of resistance on this pair. So I would favour longs on this pair, but I do see a potential move back down to retest this major downward sloping trend line first. AussieCad. AussieCad is in a wedge here. As you can see, it bounced off the top of the wedge over here, and it sold off pretty heavily. It came all the way down pretty much in one move to this to test the bottom of the wedge here, this downward sloping trend line. If we get a breakout of this downward sloping, this upward sloping trend line here, I am going to be looking for the 0.99 area of support to the downside as the next key area. However, if it stays inside the wedge, as it currently is, we might be seeing a little pullback, maybe even a retest of the wedge here, and then a bounce, possibly even all the way back up to the 1.025 area up here. So keep an eye on this. It is sitting at the bottom of the wedge, so we could be seeing some longs and some bullish momentum coming into this, or at least some bullish moves to the upside, if not momentum, if it stays corrective. Still see some bullish moves to the upside, and 1.025 area being tested once again on this pair. Aussie Japanese yen. Aussie Japanese yen, it is in a wedge, as you can see. We've got 1, 2, and we did bounce off this upward sloping trend line here. You've got the top of the wedge coming down here. So I am looking for a move back up to the retest top of the wedge potentially on this pair. However, next week it may be too far to go next week. So I am looking for some moves up to the 85 psychological level on the Aussie Japanese yen. However, looking at the structure and how it's setting up now, we could be seeing first a retest down to the 8300 level and a retest this upward sloping trend line. If we do get some shorts coming in, I'm going to be looking at taking this down for a retest of this area and the 8300 psychological level and the upward sloping trend line. And then from this position, this would be quite a nice position to look for the 85 target that I think it's going to come up to at some point, assuming it stays above this uptrend, upward sloping trend line, of course. So I do see this coming back to test the top of the wedge. The question is it going to come? Is it going to give us a chance to sell this down to the 8300 first? And if it does, then we'll be looking for longs from this position up to the 8500, as long as it stays in this wedge and above this upward sloping trend line. CAD yen. CAD yen again is in a wedge formation here because it did start to break higher. In fact, if I put a trend line on like this, you'll see we had a breakout of this downward sloping trend line here. So it is actually trending up, even though it is in this big corrective move to the downside. So it does look like it could come up and potentially test this trend line here, this downward sloping trend line here, and the 8500 psychological level in the process. I do still see potentially more moves to the downside in the bigger picture. However, because this is such a large move, we could see this come up to the 8500 first before we see some more down moves. We're not going to try and second guess the market, however, so I would only really be looking for some moves to the downside, and I do expect to come down to test its 80 psychological level down here as well. But I would probably only be looking for this once we get a breakout of this upward sloping trend line here and out of this wedge pattern here. So once we get a breakout and some accumulation, we can look at taking it down to the 800 level. But for the time being, I do see some potential moves up to the top of the wedge, or the inner wedge here, this downward sloping trend line and the 85 psychological level. So, however, just keep an eye out. If oil does start to sell off, this thing may get quite choppy, because if we have weak oil, even if Japanese yen is weak, if you have weak CAD and weak Japanese yen, this might just start going sideways. So maybe one to skip. We'll see how oil behaves next week. New Zealand Japanese yen. New Zealand Japanese yen broke out of this downward sloping trend line here, and it did bounce at the 78.927 area of resistance up here. It is actually starting to trend up, even though this is still a major down move here. So the question is this the beginning of a bigger move to the upside and a continuation of this move over here? Or are we just seeing a kind of bigger correction before some more moves to the downside? Well, again, we're not going to second guess the market. We have got a breakout of this downward sloping trend line here, so I am expecting some higher moves on this. A retest of the 78.92 area of resistance, and then once we break through here, once we break through here, I am going to be looking for this to trade into the 80 psychological level. Potentially next week, maybe the week after. Again, similar to the CadJpy, I'll only be looking at shorts on this pair if we actually break down below this upward sloping trend line here. Pound CAD. Pound CAD, we got a retest of this upward sloping trend line here, as highlighted in the last weekly Forex forecast. It has now started to find some kind of support here, and I do expect to see some higher moves in this pair if it can hold here and stay above this trend line. Would be looking for a retest of this upward sloping trend line up here, and we could be seeing this start to move in between these like this. I am looking for the 1.800 psychological level up here. So we might see a bit of a move up, a bit of a sideways move, and then maybe a retest of this area up here. So either way, as long as it stays above this upward sloping trend line, I am going to be looking for longs in the pound CAD. If it starts to break down below here, it could be pulling back to the 1.7500 psychological level. I do see this as a potential area of support, but if we start to break down below here, we could be looking at coming down to the 1.7150 area down here. However, it is in an uptrend, so we have to be favouring longs on this pair. Where it's sitting now is going to be probably quite a good position to take longs from next week if we get the right sort of setups in the lower time frames on this pair. So I am going to be looking at potentially trading pound CAD to the upside next week. Pound New Zealand. Pound New Zealand is sitting at a pretty strong resistance level. As you can see, it pretty much failed to break through here with any real follow through for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, it's pretty much been going at this for the last 2 weeks. So we could be seeing a pullback to the 1.85 area down here. And it could be a retest of this upward sloping trend line here. However, again, this is not something I would really favour shorts on. If we get a really nice setup, then I would take the short down to this area and a retest of this upward sloping trend line here. However, I would much prefer to look at buying this, and I don't want to get caught short here. So if we get a nice setup and this starts to push a little bit higher here, especially if it pushes higher and it starts to accumulate on some of the lower time frames in this kind of area, we can look at initiating longs next week. We do have some psychological areas here, but I am looking for the 1.934 area of resistance as the next key area of resistance. Whether it can do it next week remains to be seen, but I would probably think this could be a couple of weeks till it gets up to here, if not a few weeks. So my preference is for longs next week on the pound New Zealand. As you can see, it is accumulating underneath resistance, so I do expect it to push through. Pound Australia. Pound Australia broke above this resistance level here, came back, did very nicely as support, and then we did get a move we were expected up to the 1.76 area up here. It did push into this area and it started to sell off, so I would like to see some accumulation in this area, and I mean, this thing isn't an uptrend, so I would be looking as well at to initiate longs on the pound dollars next week. I would be looking for a retest of this resistance area at the 1.76, and I would like this to break through, hopefully, and we can be looking at taking a position up to the 1.780 area, which is the next key area of resistance that I see here. So if we get a nice setup here, we could take some longs back up to here, and if we get a push through, I'll be looking at adding to my positions in this area, or taking a new position in this area up to the 1.780 area. We may see a bigger correction on this pair. It is possible. However, again, because it's in an uptrend, because it's trending up, we should really need to be looking at the longs on this pair rather than the shorts. If it does pull back, really want to use that more of an opportunity to buy in at a better price than to sell against the trend here. So preferences for a longs at least up to the double top of 1.765 next week on the pound Oz. Aussie New Zealand. Aussie New Zealand, we were looking for it to. It was sitting like this in the previous forecasts, and because it is in a kind of a bull flag here on its continuation pattern, the bigger time frames, we were expecting some moves to the upside, but it broke above here, and then we got some news coming out, and it broke back inside here. Once it did this, we were looking for a test of the 1.0750 area here. It went straight through there, and it in fact made a new low down here. So We restructured our downward sloping trend line to accommodate for this low, and it didn't quite come down to the 1.0600 level, which is nice because I do expect it to trade into this level. So it bounced back up, as you can see on, I believe this was a New Zealand interest rate decision last week. This may now have given us a chance to trade this into the 1.0600 level next week. So I am looking at this move up here as a potential chance to continue in this downtrend. We see this corrective downtrend. So again, one to look out for, Aussie New Zealand. I'm going to be keeping an eye on next week. If we get some nice setups, we'll be looking at taking this down to the 1.0600 level next week. So keep an eye out on that one. Aussie franc. Aussie franc, simply put, is in this big wedge here. It is trending down, however, it bounced on this major upward sloping trend line. If I go back, you can see we've got 1 point down, 2 points down here. It did bounce off of here, so we could now be seeing a retest of the top of the wedge here and the 0.7500 level. So I do expect this to potentially come back and test the 0.7350 area, which is a retest of this upward sloping trend line. So we get something like this, and I'll pull back into this area, and then I'll be looking for setups potentially to take this to the upside and retest the top of the wedge and the 0.7500 area. So as you can see, it might just start bouncing and coiling in this kind of area here. So that's what we're looking for, as long as it stays above this trend line. If it starts to break out, then we can look at some shorts, but for the time being, I mean, this is pretty much bang in the middle now of these two trend lines. So I do expect a little pullback and then potentially a move up to the 0.7500 area next week. Euro New Zealand. Euro New Zealand broke through this resistance area here, pulled back, acted as support, pushed a little bit higher, it's pulled back, and it's acted as support again. So it is sitting above this support area now, and I am looking to take longs up to the 1.6100 area next week. Would like to see a little bit of a pullback. Maybe even a retest of this support area here. We'll see how far it pulls back, but I do want to see a pullback on this pair, and I'm going to look at take longs into the 1.6100 area next week. If we get a breakdown below this support area, then I'm going to be looking for a pullback, a bigger pullback to the 1.55 area down here. This is being a key area of support on this pair. New Zealand franc. New Zealand franc pulled up pretty hard. We're looking for shorts in this pair, but we didn't actually get any setups to the downside. I still do think this is coming down. I still see this coming down to the 0.6700 area next. So this is my next key target on the New Zealand franc, 0.6700 to the downside. It pulled up hard and it bounced from this downward sloping trend line here, and as you can see, it had a pretty big sell-off. So we would like to see this stay below this trend line, and I would be looking for some shorts in this pair in the next week and maybe the week after. Down to 0.6700 area, so I am going to be looking at initiating shorts if we get the setups in this pair. If, however, we break above this downward sloping trend, then I would be looking for some accumulation in this area above this resistance of 0.6900 here, and then we can be looking at taking potentially longs up to 0.706. But from where it's sitting, I'm liking the target of 0.6700 the best. So hopefully we'll get some nice short setups in this pair. Only if it starts to break back in out of this downward sloping trend line and back into this area, we'll be looking for potential longs to the 0.706 area of resistance. CAD franc. I did state in previous Forex forecasts on the CAD franc that because of this big sell-off here, if once we had this bounce here, I thought we could be seeing some pretty hard moves into this area because of the profit taking that we would like to see, and that is exactly what we saw. We only took, you can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 days to come in from here to here, and it only took 3 to get back from here to here. So this was a pretty big snap back in this pair, sitting right at this kind of resistance and support area here. I say that because it, it's sort of chopping over both ways at the moment. If we stay below this this area here, then I would like to see a retest down here of the wedge bottom, because it is in a wedge, as you can see. It's in a big wedge. So could be looking at a retest of the wedge bottom and the 0.7250 area, but if we start to see it breaking up here, I would like to see a retest of the top of the wedge here, but most notably the resistance area of 0.745. So this is one we just have to wait to see how it plays out next week, because it's kind of in no man's land at the moment. Next we're going to do is gold. We did get a bounce off this major downward sloping trend line in gold, and we found a little bit of support at this support and resistance area. It did break through, and once we broke through, we were looking for the bottom, or we were looking for this upward sloping trend line here. We got a breakthrough here, and we were looking for a retest of this upward sloping trend line here, but as you can see last week, price found support on this trend line here. So the question is, I mean, if it does break down through this trend line, we would be looking at a retest of this upward sloping trend line here. However, from this position, since this has now found support at this trend line, we could be seeing a bounce back up to the 12500 area, especially if we get that US dollar weakness next week that we are potentially anticipating. So if we do get US dollar weakness, I'm going to be looking into the 1250 area up here, which is a retest of this upward sloping trend line, and also the psychological area. So this is a good place to watch for if you're looking at taking longs and taking advantage of the US dollar weakness if it comes next week. And finally, we're going to finish with silver. Silver, we had this kind of big range that started to form. As you can see, it bounced here, bounced up to here, bounced from here down to here, bounced from here up to here, bounced from here, came down to here, but it didn't bounce this time. It actually went straight through, and it has found support now at the 16.14 area. So if we get some US dollar weakness, I am seeing a pullback up to the resistance area of the 16.68 up here. However, if this starts to break down, then I would be looking for the 15.83 and then the bottom of this major wedge. But I see some better opportunities than silver at the moment. If we get a break up above 16.68, I would be looking for a retest of this major upward sloping trend line. Similar to CAD franc, if we've had a quite big sell-off here, we could see some strong buying coming in here just off the back of profit taking. So we'll keep an eye on this. It may give us a good opportunity to take this to the upside if we see some strong profit taking. Otherwise, like I say, there's probably better opportunities out there. So that is it from me for this week, guys. I hope you found that helpful. If you did, just let me know by liking, sharing, and subscribing. I hope you all have a fantastic week next week, profitable week next week. Keep your eye out for any major news announcements. Trade safely, and good luck, guys.